Okay, I need to say this out loud because I've been carrying it around for 3 weeks now, and if I don't tell somebody, I think I'm going to lose my mind a little bit. Not in a dramatic way. Just in that quiet way where you keep replaying 5 minutes of your life over and over until the edges start to blur, and you can't tell anymore what actually happened and what you've rewritten in your head to make it hurt less. So here's the thing, this isn't a story about a kiss. I know that's usually where these stories go, and maybe you're expecting that, but it's not what happened. What happened was smaller than that and somehow so much bigger, and I still don't fully know what to do with it. His name is Jonah. We met when we were 8, which honestly feels like 100 years ago and also like it was last week. His family moved in 2 houses down from mine in the spring, and I remember my mom telling me to go introduce myself because there was finally a kid my age on the street, and I remember being annoyed about it because I didn't want a new friend. I already had a best friend, this kid Tyler, who moved away literally that same summer, which in hindsight is one of those things where you go, huh, life really does just rearrange itself sometimes whether you ask it to or not. Anyway, I knocked on Jonah's door with a soccer ball under my arm like that was supposed to prove something, and he opened it wearing a dinosaur shirt that was 2 sizes too big, and he just looked at me for a second and said, "I don't really like soccer," and I said, "Okay," and we ended up spending the whole afternoon in his garage building a fort out of moving boxes instead. That was it, that was the whole beginning, no lightning bolt, no cosmic sign, just 2 kids and some cardboard boxes. We were inseparable after that. The kind of inseparable where our moms stopped asking whose house we'd be at because the answer was always both, back and forth didn't matter. And at some point, I genuinely could not tell you the exact day we found this room. It was in his family's old detached garage, this little side room that used to be a workshop for whoever lived there before them. No windows except one small one near the ceiling that let in this strip of light in the late afternoon. It smelled like sawdust and old paint. His dad basically never went in there, and we claimed it. We called it the vault because we were 10 and thought that sounded cool and mysterious, and honestly it kind of was. We put a busted couch in there that Jonah's neighbor was throwing out. We taped drawings to the walls. And at some point, I think we were maybe 12, we started this notebook. Just a plain spiral notebook, nothing special. The rule was you could write anything in it, anything at all, fears, secrets, dumb thoughts, whatever. And the other person had to read it without making fun of you for it. That was the one rule, no making fun. We wrote about that thing for years. Stupid stuff mostly, which teacher we hated, which girl Jonah had a crush on that month because for a long time it was girls or he said it was and I never questioned it because why would I have? I wrote about my parents fighting. He wrote about wanting to leave our town someday and go somewhere with an ocean because we grew up about as landlocked as you can get. It was this ongoing, messy, half-illegible record of 2 kids figuring out how to be people, and it lived on a loose floorboard under the couch in the vault, and nobody else on Earth knew it existed. I want to tell you that somewhere in there I already knew how I felt about him. That would make for a cleaner story. But honestly I didn't. Or I did and I didn't let myself look at it directly, the way you know there's a bright light behind you without turning around to look at it. I just knew that being around Jonah felt different than being around anyone else, and I filed that under he's my best friend, that's just what best friends feel like, and I left it there for a long, long time. High school happened. We drifted the normal amount you drift, different classes, different friend groups bleeding in around the edges, but we still had the vault. Even at 16, 17, when it should have felt babyish to have a secret clubhouse, we still went out there sometimes, mostly at night, mostly not saying much, just sitting on that busted couch with our phones or a couple of sodas, existing in the same 8 feet of space. I think back on those nights now, and there's this one in particular that I haven't been able to stop thinking about since all this happened. We were 17. It was late, maybe 11, and we were out there and Jonah had gone quiet in the specific way he had where you could tell something was sitting on him. I asked what was wrong and he shook his head and said nothing, and I let it go because that's what you did with Jonah, you didn't push, you just stayed. And then out of nowhere, maybe 20 minutes later, he said, "Can I ask you something weird?" And I said sure, and he asked if I'd ever thought about what it would be like to kiss a guy. I remember my heart doing this stupid, obvious thing in my chest. I said, "I don't know, maybe why." And he just shrugged and said no reason and grabbed the notebook and started writing in it instead of answering, and I didn't push because that was the rule, you let people write it out if they couldn't say it. And when he handed it back to me later that night, the page was folded over and taped shut. Actual Scotch tape. And he said, "Don't read that one yet." And I said okay because I trusted him completely and I never opened it. Not that night, not the next week, not ever, because life kept happening and eventually we stopped going out to the vault as much. And then I went to college 2 states away, and he stayed local for a year before transferring somewhere else entirely. And the notebook just sat there under that floorboard, taped page and all, for what turned out to be almost 6 years. We didn't lose touch completely, that's not the story either. We texted, we called on birthdays. There was a stretch sophomore year where we barely spoke for like 4 months because I think we were both busy building separate lives and it just happens sometimes, no drama, no fight, just the way distance quietly happens. But there's one thing from that time I never told anyone about, and I think it belongs in this somewhere because I don't think I understood it until 3 weeks ago. Winter break, sophomore year. He came up to visit me at school for 2 nights because his cousin lived in the same city and he figured he'd kill two birds. We went to this party a friend of mine from my dorm was throwing, nothing crazy, just a lot of people crammed into a house that smelled like spilled beer and somebody's candle collection. I lost track of Jonah for maybe 40 minutes at some point. And when I found him again, he was sitting on the back steps outside by himself, not drunk, just sort of removed from the noise, and I sat down next to him and asked if he was okay. He said yeah, just needed air, and then he was quiet for a bit, and then he said, "Can I tell you something and you don't make it weird?" I said of course, and he looked at me for a second longer than felt normal, and he said, "I think I get why people write songs about specific people now." And I said, "Oh yeah, who?" And he just shook his head and said, "Doesn't matter, forget it," and looked back out at the yard. I didn't push, I never pushed with Jonah, that was our whole thing. But I remember sitting there in the cold with him not saying anything, and there was this moment, maybe 4 seconds, maybe 5, where he looked over at me again and I looked back and something passed between us that I genuinely could not have named at the time. My chest did this thing. And then someone from inside yelled his cousin's name looking for him, and the moment just sort of dissolved and we went back inside and neither of us ever brought it up again. Not that night, not the next morning when he left, not once in the 4 years since. I forgot about it mostly, or I told myself I did. It's funny what your brain decides to keep in storage without telling you. But we always came back to each other eventually, even through the quiet stretches. He came to my brother's wedding 2 years ago and we spent the whole reception talking to each other instead of anyone else, which my mom later told me she noticed and thought was sweet. In that way moms say things that make you wonder exactly how much they've noticed. So that's the backstory. Here's the part that actually matters. My parents sold the house last month. The house I grew up in, 2 doors down from Jonah's old place, which his family also doesn't live in anymore. They moved across town years ago. My parents are downsizing, moving to be closer to my sister and her kids, and I flew back for a week to help them pack up 30 years of a house into boxes, which is its own kind of exhausting, emotionally, physically, all of it. You don't realize how much of your life is just sitting in boxes in a garage somewhere until you have to go through all of it in 1 week. My mom kept pulling things out and holding them up like evidence. My old soccer trophies, the participation kind, nobody's fooling anybody with those. A shoebox of birthday cards. My dad found this photo on day 2, me and Jonah at maybe age 11, both of us missing the same front tooth, standing in front of the garage with our arms slung over each other's shoulders like we were posing for the cover of something. My dad held it up and laughed and said, "You two were a package deal, weren't you?" And I said, "Yeah, we were," and something about saying it out loud like that in the past tense made my chest feel tight in a way I didn't examine too closely at the time. By the third day, I needed to get out of the house for a bit. Too many boxes, too many versions of myself stacked up in the garage waiting to be decided on, kept, or thrown away. I told my mom I was going to walk around the neighborhood, and I meant it as just a walk. I promise you I wasn't planning anything. But my feet took me the way they used to take me 1,000 times as a kid down our street around the corner, and I found myself standing at the end of Jonah's old street, looking at the garage that isn't even his family's anymore, hasn't been for probably 8 years now. There's a young couple living there now with, I think, 2 little kids based on the bikes in the driveway. I wasn't going to go up to the door or anything insane like that, I just wanted to look at it, I don't fully know why. I texted Jonah without really thinking about it. Just something like, "Standing outside your old house right now, weird feeling." And he texted back almost instantly, which surprised me, and said, "Wait, are you serious?" And then, "Don't move," and I said what, and he didn't answer, and about 11 minutes later his car pulled up. He lives 40 minutes away now. I found out later that he'd basically dropped what he was doing and driven straight over, which is a detail I keep turning over in my head because it says something, doesn't it? Dropping everything for an 11-minute window where a person happens to be standing on a street. We stood on the sidewalk for a second just looking at each other, and it was that thing where you haven't seen someone in almost a year, and your body has to catch up to the fact that they're real and standing in front of you and not just a voice on the phone. He looked older, obviously, we both do now, but also exactly the same, if that makes sense. Same crooked smile, same way of standing with his weight on one leg like he's perpetually about to walk somewhere. He said, "You're really here," like it needed confirming, and I said yeah, and he said, "Come on," and started walking up toward the garage like it was still his to walk into. I said, "Jonah, that's not your house anymore, we can't just," and he said, The Renners are at their kids' soccer thing. I saw it on their fence flyer. We've got like an hour. And I stood there thinking, this man just cased a family's schedule off a soccer flyer. And also thinking, of course he did, that is exactly a Jonah thing to do. And also thinking, why do I feel like I'm 17 again standing here? We went around the side. The garage door to the side room was unlocked. Don't ask me why. Maybe the new family uses it for storage and just doesn't bother locking an interior door in their own detached garage. I don't know. It was empty. Genuinely, completely empty. No couch, no drawings on the wall. Just bare concrete and that same one small window letting in that same strip of late afternoon light. And it hit me harder than I expected, standing in that empty room, this space that used to hold basically my entire childhood, stripped down to nothing. We just stood there for a minute. Neither of us said anything. It was Jonah who finally spoke, and his voice was different, quieter than out on the sidewalk, and he said, "I used to think about this room a lot, like more than is probably normal." I said something like, "Yeah, me too," and he crouched down near where the couch used to be, running his hand along the edge of the floorboard, the exact one, and he said, "You think it's still here?" I didn't understand what he meant for a second, and then I did, and my stomach dropped in this way I wasn't prepared for. He pried at the board with his fingers and it came up easier than it should have after all these years, like the wood had just given up holding onto its secret. And underneath, in the little gap between the floor and the foundation, was the notebook. Warped from humidity, the cover curled up at the corners, but there. Just sitting there this whole time in an empty room that belonged to strangers now. He picked it up like it was something fragile and dangerous at the same time, and he didn't say anything for a second, and I didn't either, and then he flipped through it, past all our stupid teenage handwriting, past drawings and inside jokes and lists of songs we liked, until he got near the back. The taped page was still there, still folded, still sealed shut after 6 years. He looked at it for a long time, and then he looked at me. I asked him, half joking, mostly not, what if it's just embarrassing, what if it's about some girl from 10th grade and this whole thing is a letdown, and he didn't laugh at that the way I wanted him to. He just kept looking at the page, turning it over in his hands like it weighed more than paper should weigh, and he said, "It's not about a girl." I said, "How do you know? It's been 6 years, maybe you don't even remember what you wrote." And he looked up at me and said, really flatly, no joke in it at all, "I remember exactly what I wrote. I've had it memorized since I was 17. I just never let myself say it out loud, so it stayed a secret even from me, if that makes any sense." It did make sense. It made more sense than I wanted it to. He said, "I've thought about this page more than I've thought about almost anything in my life. Is that insane to say?" I said, "You don't have to show me that. If you don't want to, genuinely, it's fine." And he said, "No, I do. I think I've wanted to for 6 years and I just kept not being ready." And his hands were actually shaking a little when he peeled the tape back, which I noticed and which made my own heart do something violent in my chest, and he didn't hand it to me right away. He read it first, silently, his eyes moving over his own 17-year-old handwriting, and something happened to his face while he read it, this kind of wince like he was bracing for something, and then he held it out to me. I want to be honest with you about what it said, because I think honesty is the whole point of telling you this. It wasn't some big cinematic love confession. It was messy. The handwriting got smaller toward the bottom like he'd been writing faster, trying to get it all out before he lost his nerve. It said things like, "I don't know how to say this, so I'm just going to write it because that's easier for me. I think about you when you're not around in a way I don't think about anyone else. I asked you that thing about kissing a guy tonight because I wanted to see how you'd react, and I hated how much I cared about the answer. I'm scared that if I say this out loud it changes everything between us, and I would rather have you as my best friend forever than risk losing you by telling you the truth. So I'm going to tape this shut and probably never let you read it. And if you're reading this anyway, something happened, and I hope it's a good something." I read it twice, standing in that empty room in that same strip of light from that same small window 6 years later. And Jonah was just watching me read it, not saying anything, his arms crossed over himself in this way that made him look smaller than he actually is. And when I looked up he said, really quietly, "Say something, please, the silence is killing me a little bit." I didn't know what to say, that's the truth. I'd spent 6 years not knowing there was a version of Jonah that felt this way, and also, somewhere underneath that, not being surprised at all, like some part of me had known and just never let itself know that it knew. I said, "Why now? Why did you want to open it now?" And he said, "Because I saw your text and I got in my car so fast I didn't even grab my wallet, and I sat in traffic for like 6 minutes thinking, if I don't do this today, I'm never going to do it, and I don't want to be 40 years old writing you a letter I never send. I did that already, I don't want to do it again." I asked him if he still felt that way, what the letter said after all this time. And he looked at me for a long second and he said, "I think I've felt that way the entire time, and I think I've just gotten really good at not looking at it directly." Which, if you remember, is basically the exact thing I told you I'd done too, all those years ago, without ever saying it to him. I didn't kiss him in that room if that's what you're expecting. I know that's usually how this goes. What actually happened is smaller and somehow bigger than that. I just reached over and took his hand, which is such a small thing to do, and he let out this breath like he'd been holding it for 6 years. And we just stood there in that stripped-down, empty little room that used to hold our whole childhood, holding hands and not saying anything else for a while, because I don't think either of us knew what came after that sentence yet. We heard a car pull into the driveway outside a few minutes later. The Renners' back early soccer practice must have ended sooner than the flyer said, and we had to bolt out the side door like two teenagers again, which honestly in retrospect is kind of funny, running out of a garage that isn't even ours, hearts pounding for about 4 different reasons at once. We sat in his car afterward, parked 2 streets over, and talked for almost 2 hours. Not about the letter, not directly, not at first, about nothing, about everything. About what he's been doing for work, about my parents' move, about this dumb show we both used to watch. Circling it the way you circle something you're not ready to land on yet. At one point, I brought up that party from sophomore year, the back steps, the 4 or 5 seconds I'd apparently kept in storage without telling anyone, and I watched his whole face change when I said it, like I'd handed him something he didn't know I was carrying too. He said, "You remember that?" And I said, "I do now. I don't think I let myself remember it until about an hour ago," and he laughed, this short surprised laugh, and said, "I thought about that night probably once a week for like 2 years. I thought I made it up. I thought I was reading into nothing." I said, "You weren't reading into nothing." He didn't say anything to that. He just looked out the windshield for a second, and I could see his jaw doing this thing it does when he's trying not to get emotional in front of people, which is a thing I know about him because I've known him for 19 years, which is a strange thing to sit with, 19 years of knowing somebody's small tells. Then eventually he said, "So what happens now?" And I said, "Honestly, I don't know." And he said, "Is that an okay answer?" And I said, "I think it has to be for now." And he nodded like that was fine, like he could work with that. And then quieter, almost like he wasn't sure he should say it, he added, "I'm not going anywhere though. I want you to know that part isn't uncertain, whatever pace you need. I'm not going anywhere." I believed him. I don't know how else to say it except that I believed him completely, in a way I don't believe most things people tell me. I flew back to my apartment 4 days later. We've talked every single day since. Not different than usual exactly, except it is different in the way that a sentence changes completely when you know what's underneath it now. I don't have a neat ending for you. I know that's probably not what you want to hear at the end of a story like this. We haven't figured out what we are yet. There's a 6-year-old letter sitting folded in my jacket pocket right now, actually, because I asked if I could keep it and he said yes without even hesitating. And some nights I take it out and read it again just to remind myself it's real, that it happened, that I didn't imagine an empty room and a floorboard and a tape-shut page holding 6 years of somebody's quiet, scared, patient love for me. He's driving down to see me next weekend. That's the plan, or the beginning of one anyway. He texted me last night, actually, just a picture of his bag half packed on his bed, no caption, and I sat there staring at that photo for way longer than a photo of a half-packed bag has any right to be stared at. I texted back something dumb, something like, "Don't forget socks this time," because that's easier than saying what I actually wanted to say, which was that I've counted the days more than I'd admit to anyone but you right now. I don't know what will happen after that weekend. I don't know what we're going to call this or when, or if either of us is going to be brave enough to say the next thing out loud instead of writing it down and tapping it shut for another 6 years. Maybe we'll figure it out sitting on a different couch somewhere in some apartment neither of us can afford yet, years from now. Maybe it'll take us another 6. I used to think not knowing would drive me crazy, and maybe it still will a little. But there's something about finally being in the not knowing together instead of each of us carrying our own separate, secret version of it that makes the whole thing feel less like waiting and more like beginning. But I know that room is still there. Empty, stripped bare, belonging to somebody else's family now. And I know that whatever this turns into, it started in that same 8 feet of space where we built a fort out of cardboard boxes when we were 8 years old, not knowing yet what we were building at all. If you've ever had someone like that, someone who felt like home before you even had the words for why, I hope you find your own empty room someday. I hope you find the courage he found, sitting in traffic, deciding not to write another letter he'd never send. I'll let you know how it goes.